it is on this occasion also a very, very great pleasure for me to welcome a very dear friend and a very good colleague to the University of Granada, virtually this time, I'm afraid, Karen, but welcome again to the University of Granada.
Thank you, Dorothy.
Karen M. Lauridsen is, as you can see on the slide, an associate professor at Aarhus University in Denmark and affiliated faculty at the Center for Higher Education, Internationalization at the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore, Milan, Italy. That may ring a bell with some of you, because that is the center where Fiona Hunter, who gave our previous talk, also works. Karen has been an educational developer at Aarhus University for many years, specializing in international programs and English medium instruction. She was in particular coordinator of the Intel Uni Challenges of Multilingual and Multicultural Learning Space project between 2012 and 2015, and a partner of the EQUIP project on educational quality at universities for inclusive international programs. She has been a member, together with our colleague Nacho Blanco, of the Working Group on Education Innovation at the Coimbra Group, also for many years now. And she is, and we're very grateful to her for that, a member of our International Advisory Board here at the University of Granada, and has in that capacity visited us and knows very well the challenges which we face at the university in our internationalization plans. She has very recently, together with Janine Gregerson Hermans, published a volume entitled Internationalizing Programs in Higher Education, an educational development perspective, so a different perspective to some of the other perspectives that we have seen publications on in the field. And I'm very much looking forward to reading it in more detail than I have been able to do so far. So Karen, welcome. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be with us today. And over to you.
Thank you very much, Dorothy, and thank you to you and Nacho for the kind invitation to contribute to this, what I understand is a series of talks on different aspects of internationalization of the curriculum. I'm going to see if this works. I think you should all have received the PowerPoint presentation so that you can make notes if you want to, or go back and check something later on. But for now, it's up to you whether you need or want to look at it or not. I will share my screen here with you. And for this afternoon, this evening, I was asked to talk about teaching and learning in the international classroom. And I would like to start by asking you, what is for you an international classroom? Could you just take a few moments to think about this? What do you think about when you hear international classroom? I'm sure that if I'd been with you, I would probably have asked a couple of you to share your thoughts, but I would also assume that I would get a number of different answers to this question, what is an international classroom? Because like internationalization of higher education, it has different meanings depending on who you ask. And I'm going to share with you this afternoon my take on this and how that gets us to creating an internationalized learning experience for all our students, and give you also some examples of how that may be done. But let's start by looking at this. So what is for me an international classroom or internationalized programs? A few years back, I put together what I had from the literature and my own experience working with these matters in Denmark and in European projects. And I came up with a list of items that would belong in an international classroom or internationalized programs. And first of all, it's a curriculum content that differs depending on the discipline, but a content that includes examples from different cultures or geographical areas, or has comparisons across cultures and areas. It is also characterized by a set of intended learning outcomes that reflect such international and intercultural components. And this might also include the development of the students' intercultural competencies, and it will lead to a set of graduate attributes for the program as a whole. So there's something about the content and the intended learning outcomes, and then a program that is taught in a language that may or may not be the local or national language of the higher education institution. When I wrote this up back 2 or 3 years ago, it was very important for me to point out the fact that it doesn't all have to be in English. There's so many people who still think that international education, international programs or international classrooms, that's what takes place in English. And I know, because I have the pleasure of hearing how you progress in these matters. So I know that you have a language policy for the University of Granada, which says that at the university, Spanish is an asset. And with a big world language like Spanish, you are in a privileged position in that you can have internationalized programs in Spanish and in English, and have international students in both, which is not the same as if you were in a country like Denmark, where we have very few students who choose to study through Danish if they are not Danish by birth. So, the curriculum content, the intended learning outcomes, the language of instruction, and then a program that is taught to a diverse group of students. And I would claim that in any case, the way the world looks today, demographic differences occur, differences in race, values, beliefs, ethnic background, and so on, differs even from even among the local students. But of course, if you then have students who come in from other parts of Europe or other parts of the world, that demographic difference becomes even more pronounced. Students can also have different educational backgrounds. At least if we talk about master programs, they might have different bachelor programs or backgrounds, and they might come from different national systems. And of course, they may or may not have different first languages and cultures. So content, learning outcomes, language of instruction, and the student cohort, the diversity of the student cohort, are some of the characteristics of an international classroom and of internationalized programs. But sometimes it's not all 4 points that are relevant, but some of them still are relevant in a particular concrete context. And whatever the mixture of these characteristics are, they have implications for how we teach and how the students learn in an international classroom or an international learning space. And the reason why I talk about learning space is perhaps more obvious now that we have all been suffering under the COVID restrictions for the past year, in the sense that a classroom sounds very much like a physical place, a building in the university. But as we all know, student learning can take place in many different spaces, and certainly both physical space and online. Now, this here is my take on what I mean when I talk about the international classroom. And I want you now to take a moment to reflect on this and think about the extent to which you already have an international classroom and you already design or teach internationalized programs. And if you have a comment or question, I would ask you to write it in the chat, and we will have a break a little later when I will then return to what is in the chat and see if I can answer some of your questions. So just a couple of minutes here and then I'll continue. So I started out by talking about an internationalized program or an international classroom. I would like to then move on to what I call an internationalized learning opportunity for all students. My concept of the international classroom, or my understanding of an international classroom, which I just shared with you, is based on the literature on international education, which I know that you are familiar with, at least some of it, at the University of Granada. And then I'll talk about how we zoom in on the student and how we create an internationalized learning opportunity for all our students. And then afterwards move on to talking about how we facilitate this learning opportunity, and then the wrap up. But between points 2 and 3, I'll give you a break so that you can all survive being at the screen again for an hour and a half. Okay, so let's move on now and talk about an internationalized learning opportunity or learning experience for all students. And the most important word here is perhaps all students, because I'm not talking about the mobile students, I'm talking about all students in the classroom, whether you have only locals or a combination of local and mobile students, or whether you teach in Spanish or you teach in English. And this concept, which I'll define for you in a little while, is based on these generally acknowledged definitions that I will now share with you. The first of them is the internationalization of higher education. And I know that you are familiar with this definition that you see on the screen now, because it is part of the basis for the internationalization policy at the University of Granada. The three things that are, to me, are very important here, that are all in the definition, and then a couple of things which I think are important to note that are not there. First of all, this definition by Hans de Witt and his colleagues say that internationalization of higher education is an intentional process of integrating international, intercultural, and global dimensions. It's very important to say that if we internationalize our curricula and everything that comes with it, it doesn't happen of and by itself. Somebody has to do something, have an intention with doing this, and then carrying that through. The other point that I want to make is it's not only intentional, but it's actually also considered a quality driver to have an international, intercultural, and global dimension in the purpose, functions, and delivery of education. And the third point I want to stress here is, again, that it is for all students, so that when the students graduate, they are in a position with the knowledge and the experience and the attitudes that they have, competences that they have gained while at university, that they can make a meaningful contribution to society. Now, this here, of course, is sort of the meta level for what is the institution to do. And I always think that it's interesting to say that it doesn't say anything about mobility as a key for internationalizing higher education. And the other thing is, it doesn't say it has to happen in English. But you're familiar with this one, so let's move on to internationalization of the curriculum. And for those of you who had an opportunity to listen to our colleague Fiona Hunter from Milan, when she talked about it, I'm sure that she also shared this with you, the definition by Betty Lesk on the internationalization of the curriculum. And you see again the international, intercultural and global dimensions of a university program, the content, the learning outcomes, assessment tasks, and teaching methods. And that speaks directly to what we will be talking about for the rest of this session. And then, of course, internationalization at home, again, aligned with internationalization in general and internationalization of the curriculum. And here's this definition by Josh Billen and Elspeth Jones. But I think they're important because they also, internationalization at home also speaks to the idea of the domestic or the local learning environment also as a chance to have these international, intercultural and global dimensions. Now I took these three definitions and zoomed in a publication from last year more on what is in it for the student. What is it with all these very nice words? What is it that we try to create for the students so that they benefit from this whole operation? And that's when I came up with the concept of an internationalized learning opportunity or learning experience as an opportunity for all students, irrespective of their provenance, so whether they're local or mobile, to learn in a higher education setting together with their peers. I think together with their peers is very important because we want the students to learn with and from each other. And in order for this to happen, there has to be this alignment of the content, the teaching and learning activities, and the assessment forms that allow the students to meet internationalized intended learning outcomes and to develop international intercultural graduate attributes as discipline-specific or generic competencies and skills. So as I'm sure you also heard when Fiona talked about internationalization of the curriculum, a key component here is to write the intentions behind that into the intended learning outcomes for the students. So what are the international intercultural dimensions of the content that we want them to learn, and also how can they develop more generic international and intercultural competencies and skills as they go through their program of study. And all of these factors, when they are in place, we may develop an internationalized learning opportunity into a learning experience for all students, not only those who are mobile. And I think it's very important to keep this in mind, that nowadays we talk about all students. And sometimes we see that the local students don't quite get it. I was just talking to a group of educators here in Denmark in another session earlier this afternoon, and it came up again for I don't know, the umpteenth time, that sometimes the Danish students don't understand why they should, if they have gone into a Danish program and enrolled in a Danish program, why should they then be concerned with international intercultural dimensions? And you might also have Spanish students who ask you the same question. So I think it's very important that we are transparent about why we do this and why we try to involve all students, what's in it for them. It's sometimes more difficult if they have to work together with some peers from another institution or some of the international students coming into Granada or whatever. but there's something in it for them that we need to explain to them right at the beginning of their program, so that they know that there is this international, intercultural, and global dimension that come into their programs of study. So how do we actually create this internationalized learning opportunity? As I said, content, teaching, learning, and assessment, leading to internationalized learning outcomes, leading again to some generic or specific disciplinary competences and skills, and part of the graduate attributes when they complete their studies. All of this, of course, looks slightly different depending on who's in the student cohort and what's the language of instruction. So it's the 3 building blocks at the top that interact with the students and the language of instruction at any given moment. So internationalization abroad and at home, all of it can make or can offer this internationalized learning experience for the students. And we have talked now for 3 decades about mobile full degree students, physical student mobility in exchanges or internships abroad, and more recently also about virtual mobility, where the individual student can choose to follow a program at another, at a distance, at another higher education institution, complete that and get credit for it in their own institution. So these are the students' own choices. These are the ones who want the international component, intercultural component, and they can choose to do so. And I know that you have a lot of this in place at the University of Granada. But there's also the new opportunity for having blended mobility, which you may already be familiar with, but it's a possibility that has been boosted with the new Erasmus program, so that you can get funding for having, say, a group of students from Granada go to another university as part of a as part of a course that they have a few days, perhaps a week at another university, and team up with peers at that university, and then start a project together, work together then online, and then perhaps you have these other students come to Granada at the end, and they finalize their projects and then present them to each other, and they are assessed and so on and so forth. So it's collaboration between the lecturers in a program or in a course in your own university, collaborating with their peers to create this blended mobility experience for both student cohorts. That blended mobility involves, as I said, physical mobility with collaboration online, but of course collaboration online can also be just online, as in collaborative online international learning, which or COIL, which is often referred to now. It's actually been in existence for quite a number of years, but this is where groups of students work together on a given challenge or a project, and again could be part of their program at Granada, that for a certain number of days or weeks they work on a program online with their with peers at another higher education institution. And finally, of course, we have to ask ourselves, when we talk about internationalization, is this for the full program, or is it for some of the modules? Or even if you say that there is an international or intercultural component to this program, is it equally pronounced in all the courses or modules in the course of a 3 or 2 year program, or is it restricted or limited to some of the modules in that program? So there are quite a few questions to ask, but also, is it something that the students do themselves, or is it something that you integrate into your teaching and learning? Now, again, I want you to think about what you have just heard. Take a moment to reflect on it. And if you have any comments or questions, then write that into the chat. And then I'll continue again in just a little while. But just think for yourself and write your questions if you have any, or comments, sarcastic remarks into the chat. Now let's start looking at how we can put all these nice ideas into practice. Because if we are going to create an internationalized learning opportunity and learning experience for all students, how can we actually do that? And I said part of it is, of course, that we can allow students, or we can encourage students to be mobile themselves, or whether physically or virtually. And we can also build, as I just said, some elements of physical or virtual mobility into a given program or into a given course in a specific semester, where students then work with their peers in another higher education institution. But let's be a little bit more concrete and look at what we can do. And first of all, the question is, how do we make internationalized learning outcomes? And that can happen at a program level. So I'm going to talk about this example here at program level, at a module level, and then how that can actually happen. And I've taken the example of a nursing graduate, or a student of nursing. And what I share with you here has been taken from the national curriculum for a nursing degree in Denmark, where there is a general national curriculum for this bachelor, this professional bachelor degree, and then a certain leeway for the individual higher education institutions to have some variation in parts of the program. But there is a general profile that they all have to adhere to. And it's divided into knowledge, skills, and competences. And this is, of course, not all of it, but I picked out this one, which I think is important to look at in our context. And here it says that the nursing graduate has knowledge about and is able to reflect on knowledge about individual, social, cultural, religious, international, and ethical conditions, and the way they influence the experiences and reactions of individuals facing illness and other health challenges. So this is the knowledge bit. That's then followed up in skills, where it says that the nursing graduate is able to evaluate and communicate cultural, international, and ethical insights in the care and treatment of patients based on the applicable code of conduct and legal framework. And finally, the competencies that the nursing graduate is able to participate empathically, ethically, and reflectively in the care of patients and in encounters with patients or citizens characterized by diverse cultural, professional, political, economic, and social perspectives, and to intervene within the applicable codes of conduct and legal frameworks nationally and internationally. So this is from the Danish Ministry of Science and Education, and it's my translation from the Danish ministerial order. So here we have a national curriculum for a program that by definition is taught in Danish to Danish students or Danish speaking students across the country. But they actually have quite clearly an international and intercultural dimension in this curriculum. Now, you may ask, how do we do that? And it's not so that it necessarily goes into all the modules, but there must be one or more modules where this is taken up. And I just discussed it earlier today with one of the participants in the other talk that I gave, and she who was doing a nursing training, and she says, yes, we do that, but it's important that we do it at different moments in the course of the students' 3 years of studies with us. But one of those moments could be in a module where students are expected to identify and appropriately respond to patients' cultural and religious needs. And in the book that Dorothy was kind enough to mention, which by the way has not been published yet. It's in print or it's in publication in production at the moment, but it will come out in June. So the example is discussed here, but I will just share with you how can this be done. And if you think about this, there are a couple of moments in our lives where our cultural backgrounds, our beliefs, our ethics, our religion, and so on, plays a role. And that is when we come into this life, and it's also when we are leaving again. So these are good examples to use when you talk with or when you try to train students to live up to an internationalized learning outcome like the one you see on the screen here. And in the Interuni project, we actually had an example that was medical students, but it could also have been nursing students. But what they did with the students was that they were divided into small groups. And this happened to be a program in English in another European country, so that they had a combination of local and mobile students. But you could also do this with local students only. So the students were divided into groups, and they then watched 3 videos of how to care for terminally ill patients in 3 very different parts of the world, geographically, culturally, ethnically, religiously, and so on. And the students then were asked to compare, after they had watched the videos, then together they were to compare, to identify the similarities and the differences, and to try to explain these differences. And of course, all the students had, if you take the student group as a whole, they had diverse backgrounds themselves, and they could also see how this was approached from very different perspectives in these 3 different hospital contexts in different parts of the world. And it helped them to identify the little things also that create these intercultural differences. And it also helped them to put what they took for granted into perspective. So if they were very much sort of homegrown students who had grown up in the local context and had their first experiences at hospital wards, also in the same context in the university hospital, they thought that is how this is done. But actually, what they learned from this experience, from this peer group assignment, was that could not be taken for granted, that there were other ways that were equally good or valid in context, and that the approach that they had learned was very much determined by their local culture and the way that things were normally done where they were located. So this is an example of how you might bring in an international or intercultural dimension. Now, you don't have to have the responsibility for designing or teaching a program in medicine or nursing, could be anything else. But the whole idea of this can be transferred to a number of other disciplines. Think about watching a meeting taking place in different contexts and the different hierarchies that are at play there if you observe a meeting or an instance of negotiation, business negotiations and what have you. There are all kinds of different things. So all the examples I give, think about them as what they are, examples from a specific context that can be translated into other disciplines and contexts. So let's move from the learning outcomes and instead look at the content of the program. And this is where it always becomes difficult to talk about because internationalized content or the content of a given program can only be determined among the disciplinary experts. So you, ladies and gentlemen, all know what is the core and what could be the international intercultural dimension of your program. But let me give you some examples and then I'll leave it to you to think about what that might mean and what you would suggest to your colleagues or what you already have in the programs that you are responsible for or the courses that you teach. So the nursing example I just gave you could also be different conditions for food production in different geographical locations, climate zones, what have you. That could be for a program in microbiology, or it could be for a program in management, so production management, or it could be a part of a program in wine production. There are all sorts of possibilities here, but you compare what is the condition for what we're talking about in different cultures, different geographical locations, and how is that dealt with in different parts of the world. In your part of Spain, you can grow your tomatoes outside. In my part of the world, you have them in hothouses most of the year. So a very basic example of what I'm talking about. And if you have students from different parts of the world, you can get them to look into what this looks like in where they come from, and then they can compare notes in your international classroom. Could be comparison of parliamentary systems in different countries, similarities and differences. Again, draw on the knowledge and experience of the students. Could be, if you were talking business and management, it would be different leadership styles, different hierarchies. In some countries, there's a very steep hierarchy and you can't do anything on the floor unless you've asked your superior who has asked the superior, and so on and so forth. And I come from a country that has a very flat hierarchy and where a lot of the responsibility is delegated also to people who are on the low levels of the hierarchy. So again, depending on what discipline, there are different ways of doing that. And then, of course, there are some disciplines that are inherently international business, or the development application of information technology, or as somebody told me just very recently, the games industry, so computer games industry, is so inherently so international that it doesn't make sense to talk about internationalization, because it's simply the DNA of that particular industry. And training students for a job when they graduate in that industry has to take place in an international environment. So think about again very briefly what might be the international or intercultural dimensions in the learning outcomes and content of the programs that you design or teach. And if you have any questions, again, share them in the chat. Okay, so learning outcomes and content. Let me say that a lot of the international intercultural dimensions actually go into that, and that's what a lot of people don't really think about. But I now want to turn to teaching and learning and student collaboration, and I'll very much focus that on student peer groups. Groups where students can learn from and with each other. And if you have an international classroom with a lot of mobile students also in the student cohort, you can form peer groups, and I'll come back to that in a little while, where the students actually can take advantage of the fact that they have so different backgrounds. And in other contexts, if you have more or less only local students, then still they can collaborate, and I'll give you some examples of that. I'm not talking about getting them in a seminar to talk about whatever is the topic of the day for 5 minutes with the person sitting next to them or something like that. I am talking about sort of challenges, tasks, projects that take some time or some days or weeks of the academic term. That can, of course, be on-site, in the physical classroom, in either multicultural groups or in more homogeneous teams, depending on your student cohort. Could be all Spanish, or could be more multicultural, and you can then have the students form multicultural groups. Again, you can think about different geographical, cultural, linguistic, continue the list, perspectives on the disciplinary content that you're teaching. It can be live cases with local businesses and organizations that the students are to solve. And these cases may in themselves have an international intercultural component. So in a business program, how can we extend our export to a particular location and culture? Or it might be live cases, or how do we deal with patients, or live cases of how do we deal with this particular issue in a legal context. So is it Spanish law or is it European law that's at play here? Continue the list yourself. These are just examples that could give you get you thinking about this. Role plays is a different that students are asked to form a project group where they have different roles. I have one particular example, but it can also be from any other disciplinary context. But where I used to work at the business school, they would have a semester in a master program where they had both mobile and local students, and they had the first half of the semester was regular lectures on the topic, and then they had a task or project, and that was defined by a business or an organization. So it was high stakes. It was a real thing. And then they were given different roles. So one of them would be the CEO of the company that the students formed as a consultancy company for this particular business or organization. And there would be a CAO. They always made sure, for instance, also that there was somebody who was responsible for their communication, that there was somebody who was very good at statistics, because otherwise they couldn't solve the problem. So students formed groups. These groups were in fact simulations or role play simulations of a group of consultants. And they had different expertise and different roles, and then they played this with their in the second half of the semester, finally submitting their report, and that was then the written assignment for their final exam. They had to defend it at an oral exam, and at that time also the business or organization who had given them the task to begin with would be present and provide feedback to the students. So on site, a number of different opportunities for having students work together on in groups, in peer groups or teams. Blended mobility, which I've also talked about what it is. I'd give you an example of that. Could be how to teach Spanish. So you could, for instance, envisage a group of students who were studying Spanish and going to teach Spanish as a foreign language in another European country or somewhere else in the world, and then have a group of students in Spain, presumably at the University of Granada, who were also trained to teach Spanish to foreign students. Bring these two groups of students together and let them provide, develop some material together and discuss how that could be done, both in Granada and the other university. So that would be one of many examples of what could go into a project under blended mobility, where they get a chance also to meet each other. And then again, collaborative online international learning actually happens, I know, in a lot of technical universities. It also happens in the humanities with teaching languages, but I think it's one of the areas that's picking up with a lot of disciplines now, trying to establish collaborative online international learning. Again, a group of students from Granada, say, working together with students in student groups or teams in another university. If students are to work together in peer groups, and if it's something that takes a certain amount of time, say half the semester or 3 weeks or the whole semester, whatever it is, it's important that you reflect on the criteria for forming groups. So would you just randomly assign students, or would you base it on specific criteria? I would say that if you have work which also counts against the final assessment for the students, you would need to have some criteria so that you try to the best of your ability to form groups that are not dysfunctional from the beginning. For instance, if they need to be able to interpret statistics, you need to have somebody in there who can do statistics. But there are other areas of knowledge and competence which are discipline specific and which you may want to ensure that you have represented in each of the groups. But other than that, criteria might also include students with the same first language and culture or with different. So the Danes allowed to be with the Danes and the Spanish people with the Spanish people, and so on and so forth. Well, sometimes in the first year, if it's the first time students do a project, and if it's there are other challenges for them, it might make sense that they work together with somebody who has the same linguistic and cultural background as themselves. And then perhaps in the second or the third year, they might then go into multicultural and multilingual groups. So again, should they have different national disciplinary backgrounds, or are there specific competencies that are important for the task? Also, who decides do you give them criteria and then ask them to form the groups themselves, or so that they can self-select their peers, or do you decide? There are pros and cons for both solutions here. The downside of having students self-select is that they would very often go for somebody who is too much like themselves, so they don't get the challenge of being of working with somebody who is different from themselves, and where they really get these intercultural differences to the fore. There's also the danger that you will end up with a group of students who nobody wants to be with. And as educators or lecturers, we have to address that, at least reflect on how we're going to deal with it for ourselves. So my solution would be to divide the students into groups so that it's the lecturer or you who decides. But that's my personal point of view. I've seen too many projects go south because of student self-selection here. And then, of course, you do need to think about what you will do if and when a conflict arises. How would you facilitate conflict resolution? And I think that always goes for group work. And I know that you might not all have had a lot of teamwork or group work in your disciplines and the courses that you teach, but it is part of sort of an active learning 21st century approach to teaching and learning, that students should work in groups and thereby prepare themselves also for the realities of the labor market and the professions that they will join later on. And that's also why I would suggest that you do this to the extent that you take one step at a time. So if you're used to this, you can go further. If you're not used to this, you may want to do it one step at a time. Because as I said, having students work in peer groups based on the constructivist approach to teaching and learning, and unfortunately I can't go into that, but you can Google it. But the idea is that each student learns in his or her own unique way. And the only way that you can learn is to get involved yourself and do the work. You can't just have it served to you on a silver platter. You have to do the work of taking in information and processing it and see how you can use it and adapt it later on. So there is this constructivist approach, active learning, as I said, get the students, don't just lecture to them, but get them to be active themselves. I've given you a very small example of that with the breaks that I have put into this lecture here this afternoon, but it's something that you might do in your own lectures also. It's also about thinking how you can develop intercultural skills and competences as part of the learning activity, and what is sometimes referred to also as 21st century skills, the graduate attributes also that enhance the students or the graduates' employability when they leave the university. So having them work in groups is there's a learning background for doing that. We know that that giving them these active cases, giving them these active challenges, giving them these projects to complete helps them to work with the material and learn, and it also prepares them for their professional future. And as I said, if this is new, then take it one step at a time. If it's not so new, you can reflect on how you want to move further with such initiatives. Now, of course, whether you teach in English or you teach in Spanish, you might be teaching students who are learning through a foreign language. So when you do presentations for them, it's very important that you don't forget to signpost your key messages. You would, or you might have observed what I have done in the course of this afternoon. I said, now we have looked at A, B, and C. Now I move on to this. I will now move on to my conclusion here is. So have this meta language, as we also call it, the meta language of helping students find their way through a text or through your lecture or your presentation. Also provide a multimodal input. It's much easier for students to follow a presentation in a foreign language or in their second language, whatever. It's more important in any case to have a visual input together with the oral input. I'm sure that it's easier for you to follow my presentation now because you have my PowerPoint slides in addition to what you hear in your headsets or comes out of the speakers on your computer. And the same if you're in a physical room. And we also know that what we see and what we hear, what we can touch and so on, the visual input is by far the most important input for our brains when they process new information. So that visual input is sometimes much stronger than the oral input. Depends on the individual, but oral and visual input at the same time helps them better process what you're trying to say. And then insert short breaks or timeouts, like when I've asked you to reflect on the key topic that I have just talked about. It's part of processing. It's also allowing your brains to just catch up and process everything before you take the next step, move on to the next topic. And that certainly also applies to your students. And then it's important to speak clearly. So have the right pronunciation and speak clearly and not too fast. If you are running out of time, don't speed up. Just accept that there is something that you can't say, because if you talk too fast, your students are lost immediately. And then avoid too sophisticated expression. Don't dumb down your language, but don't use sort of figurative speech that is too difficult for the students to process. You can, for instance, say, we've been addressing these problems, but we are not out of the woods yet, would be a British English explanation or expression, sorry, a British English expression. We're not out of the woods yet. But a lot of students wouldn't be able to understand what that means. So instead you can say, we have addressed these problems, but we haven't found all the solutions yet. That's much easier for the students to understand. And then you might think about, at least for the first or second year students, to help them produce glossaries of key terms of their topic in the language of instruction, and then in their own first language. I'm not saying that you should provide a glossary for all your courses, but you can help students via your content management system or any kind of information technology and an app or whatever your IT department and Nacho can come up with, help them develop sort of, so this is the term in English, this is the term in Spanish, what's the definition, and that helps the student get the core of the content that they are learning and talk about it with the right terminology. Both in one and the other language. And as I said, you're not to produce all the glossaries. It's part of the work the students should do themselves, and help them also be actively involved in that to support the learning of a particular topic. Now, I've talked about some examples of how you might create an internationalized learning opportunity for all your students. I've said something about the alignment of the learning outcomes, the content, the learning activities, and how you may, both for the content and so on, develop students' international and intercultural knowledge and competencies, and the language issues. Now, I want you to reflect on what you have already done, because you may have been doing a lot of what I've talked about this evening. How you can move forward, whether you're starting or you're continuing work that has already been started, work with your peers, work on your own, what might be an opportunity here for you, and what might be a challenge or a blocker, and how you can remove these blockers. And I'd invite you to do that. And then I'm going to turn off the PowerPoint presentation now. The next one is an ad for my upcoming book with Janine Gregersen, and then there's also a list of the references that I've used in this presentation. So I'll turn off the presentation now. You all have it, and then have a look at the chat. And I've already noted something in the first break. And if you have further questions or comments, please add them into the chat now.